Okay, good morning. So this will be part 3 of the series I began on the Drushe Pesach and HaChassidus, how to look at Pesach through the eyes of and the lens of HaChassidus Chabad. So it's really somewhat of a summary of the different Mamorim, starting from the Alter Rebbe through the Rebbe, including also the Mechtavim Klolim, the Rebbe's letters that he wrote every year before Pesach, usually 1 or 2 letters, either Rosh Chodesh Nisan or Aleph Nisan, usually dated. So the first week I spoke, gave an overview of the different nations, the different themes, and the focus I spoke there was about Ariz Gein von Mitzarim v'Gvulim. That the central theme of Pesach is Mitzrayim, Lashon Mitzarim v'Gvulim, limitations, and the Kayach Hanechi Hashem Alekecha Sheisichem Eretz Mitzrayim, the power to go out of all the Hagbolas, all the limits and constraints of this world, Gashmius, Beruchnius, the real meaning of Cherus. And the second part I spoke about, which was last week, spoke about Matzah and Chometz, the central theme of Bittul, of Pesach being a Inyani Bittul. What I wanted to cover today is the Inyan of Birurim, how Mitzrayim plays a central role in essentially the Avedis Adam B'chlal, and of course connects then with both what happened then and throughout history, leading ultimately to the Gula Mitzvah Vashlema, which is like the second half of the Gula. That's why the Haggadah is really split into 2 parts. The first half is mostly about Gulas Mitzrayim. The second half is about the Gulas Hasidah. Because Kimei Tzeichem Eretz Mitzrayim Aren and Eflois, the future Gula, which we're now on imminent at its threshold, is compared to Gulas Mitzrayim in many, many ways. Goel Rishon, Goel Achrein, Moshe, Mashiach, Shlach Nabi Atishlach. So I want to talk about that from how HaChassidus explains it in a deeper way, which also, just as the first 2 parts, teaches us why Tzis Mitzrayim and Pesach is such a central Yom Tov. Rishon l'Regalim, there's no other mitzvah or Yom Tov that is mentioned more in Torah and in our mitzvahs and in our customs and minhagim than Zeichel Yitzis Mitzrayim. Chai b'chol der v'der chai v'adam lirasas b'kol yatzim Mitzrayim b'chol yem v'yem. We mention it every day in the Sheish Chidus and many more times. I mean, wherever you turn, you almost see it everywhere. In Aseres HaDibros, in Shema. I mean, it's everywhere. Mezuzah, film. Besides, of course, the Pesach itself. So, of course, begs the question: what's so central about it? Why is it more central than, let's say, Matan Torah or Sukkot? So let's talk about this, the Birurim. The main sources of what I'm going to be discussing now is from Torah Eir, Pasha Vayeshev, of course also Pasha Shmeis, especially Mamorim of the Rebbe Rashab, the Hemshech Pesach Tofrei Samach Tes, and the Frierdiker Rebbe's Tovshin Tes, which is based on Tofrei Samach Tes. So, start with the Medrash. The Medrash says that Mitzrayim, Golos Mitzrayim, and Gulas Mitzrayim, Golos Mitzrayim is Reish L'chol HaGolius. So in other words, every Golos that we've been through, whether it's Golos Bavel, or Golos Paras Hamadai, or Golos Yovan, and Golos Edom, which is the Golos we're in now, is all rooted in the Reish L'chol HaGolius. The head is Mitzrayim. In the language of Kabbalah, that Mitzrayim is the klipa of Keser, the Golos in Keser. And Keser is the head. Everything starts from Keser. So Keser, and then you have the different Golias. Each one covers a different, especially in the Maimorim, Samach Tes and Tovshin Tes, talks about how each Golos addresses the Golos in different midas or meichin and so on. So that tells us that Mitzrayim has in it something central that happened there that really led the way, both in the Golus level and also Geulas Mitzrayim. Therefore, is also Reish L'Chol HaGeulas. That's why we say Ki Meitzeis Chemeretz Mitzrayim, or as Chassidus emphasizes, Elamasei Bnei Yisrael Sheyotzum Mitzrayim. So the question is, what do you mean Elamasei? The 42 Masayis, only the first one was out of Mitzrayim from Ramses. The other ones were in the Midbar somewhere. But because all the 42 Masayis were always leaving Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the central place that we're leaving. So even when the last of the 42 Masayis, Me'ever Liyarden, is also a hemshech of leaving Mitzrayim. The simple explanation, based on what we discussed, is because Mitzrayim is Mitzarim V'Gvulim. So every Golus that's the Golus. The Golus is all rooted in the idea of Meitzer and Gvul. So all the Goliaths are rooted there, and the Geulos Mitzrayim is going out of Mitzrayim and Gvulim, so it represents the Geula from every Meitzer, including the other Goliaths. And then when you break it down, it breaks down into different categories, so to speak, different types of exiles, or I like to use the word displacement is the right word. Exile. When we say Golus exile, say Mipnei Chateinu Galinim Artzenu. So we know that doesn't just mean physically leaving Eretz Yisrael, because you can be in Eretz Yisrael and also be Galinim Artzenu. Because it's a ruchnisdik Golus. It's not just a physical that we were banished from the physical land. So that's the general idea. But when you go deeper into these Mamorim, it starts talking about it a little more in depth. So we all know the concept in Kabbalah, Chassidus elaborates, of Bidur HaNetzutzis. I want to talk about that a few minutes. I mean, something we use so often, Bidur HaNetzutzis, refining the sparks, or separating. Bidur really means to separate, to clarify, and to refine, if you want the real English translations. Because Bidur, like in Hilchos Shabbos, Bidur is to separate, or sometimes it means to clarify, Levarer, Bidur Halacha, for example. But also Bidur here means that we're taking the sparks, the divine sparks that the Eibishter embedded in each part of existence. Everything in this world has a divine spark that gives it chayis. Mahava machayim mekayim, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Shayachud Vamun, everything. It all rooted in the Chov Beis Eisius of Torah, which start with Hasarim Amoris, and from there, through the Chilufim and Tmuris and Gematrius, everything in existence. It doesn't say Evan, for example, in the Seres HaDibros. Hasarim Amoris, but in a combination of letters is there. So Evan gets its chayis from those letters. So everything in existence is a chayis aliki. However, in Atzilus, the Kelim are aware of the chayis aliki. But in Bria, Yetzirah, and especially in Asiyah, Gashmis, Achumnis, we're not aware. Like we learn in the Bas Legani, in Perik and Gimel, that Atzilus is Elam HaAchdus, so it's aware. But later it becomes nifrodim, which means in our hergish, we don't feel the lukus. So you look at a table, a chair, piece of bread, whatever it may be in this world, it's an aveda. That's why lechem is called from the word milchama. It's a milchama. Nama pum lechel, because it's a milchama to release and free the spark within. In simple English, it means to release the energy that's trapped in matter, requires work. And that's what's called Bidur HaNetzutzis. Okay, that means it's working, right? Good. So, more specifically, says the Arizal, Bidur HaNetzutzis obviously is a concept that exists from the beginning, from Torah itself. But the Arizal's Meirich on it, especially in Eitz Chaim, that where is it hinted to in the Torah? So it's right in the beginning. Say Bereshit bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. Then it says, what does it say? Va'aretz says tohu v'veyu v'cheshach al pnei hatehem v'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim. It's maybe the most cryptic verse in all of Torah. What does this mean? You know, the creation of heaven and earth. Okay, what's this? The tohu v'veyu and cheshach and ruach Elokim and merachefes and mayim. I mean, it's a whole very mysterious pasuk, and you really can't understand it without Kabbalah, even though the Ramban and all the commentaries explain it. But at the end of the day, what is it really going on? So it's talking about the Elam HaTohu. That's the first time we have Tohu. What's Tohu? Tohu, there's Eris and Kelim. but they're not, there's dissonance between them, there's tension between them. Eris merubim, kelim mu'atim. So basically, they can't survive. So that's why there was the concept of shviras hakelim. And that's what created Tayu Vavayu. Literally means chaos or emptiness, or the different words that Ramban calls it Tayu from the word confusion. Matinas ha'odam, and wonder. And from that, Shviras HaKelim, which is of course not Begashmis, that created ultimately the scattering of the Netzutzes. Because in other words, until the Shviras HaKelim, the Eris and Kelim were speaking to each other. But imagine, if, let's say just an example, a good example for this is you have a book, a sefer, and you have letters on the page, and the letters are conveying an idea, and someone then comes and tears up the pages. Or the letters can't fully contain the air, so what happens? So now you have scattered all over, torn pages, and Veda now is to come and gather it together and reorganize it, connect them all the dots. So in this world, that's exactly what's going on. There's netzutzes scattered everywhere. Each of us is sent down lamata to this world to find the sparks that are allocated to us. Where are they? The hashgacha pratis of your life. Where you were born, what language you speak, what esek you're involved in, the people you know. Everything in your life, you're led there, Hashem etzadigov kenanu, in order for you to take those sparks and elevate them. That's the whole yesod of it all. The Baal Shem Tov talks about it, the Alter Rebbe. I mean, it's really, if you think about it, just another way of explaining what shlichus is. It's to go everywhere in the world and find the sparks and gather them together again. La'asif, to gather them together. The Rebbe spoke about Hakel. This year's a Shnas Hakel. The Rebbe said, what's Hakel Baruch? It's exactly that. Hakel Noshim B'taf is human beings, but it also refers to all the scattered sparks that are everywhere. That's why the Gemara says, HaChassidus brings, Stokos HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Yisrael Shapizron Bein HaUmis. So of course the question is, what kind of tzedakah is that? Pizron Bein HaUmis is Golos. It's Golinim Artzeinu, it's Mechpnei Chatenu. Why is it such tzedakah? Because Stokos HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shapizron Bein HaUmis, HaChassidus explains, Umis is referring to all the sparks that are scattered Bein HaUmis, and the tzedakahs are us to be able to go there and elevate them. That's the tzedakah. The Eibishter gave us a bracha. Or it says, Kol HaGoli is only the, says Kadesh, what's the Lashon? Yeah, what's the Lashon? That the whole Golus is not a Kadei, the Hesiv Gadim. What does that mean? We know, as a matter of fact, we're supposed to dissuade someone from becoming a Ged. So here again, the Mitler Rebbe explains, based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, that Gadim means they're in the Tzutzis. That's what Golus is about. Now, obviously, in time of the Beis Hamikdash, it was easier Aveda because it was more Mesudar. Golus literally means that there's Pizron and we're all over. We are all over, the Eden, Mefuzar Mefeded Bein Ha'amim, and the sparks are everywhere. So that is hinted to in the rest of the verse. So it said, Toyu Vavayu, V'cheshel Hapnei Sehem. We're going to go into detail, but basically it's a world that's dark and we don't see the light. Till the next pasuk is Vayi Eir, Vayimer Elikim Yeir. And what comes next is V'ruach Elikim Merachefes Al Pnei Hamayim. So the word Merachefes is what I want to focus on. What does that mean? So it means to hover. It's a shveben in Yiddish. So Al Darizal Taich's Merachefes is made up of two words. Rapach Mes. That's referring to the Misa, Mes, Vayimlach, Vayamos, and end of Pasha Vayishlach, referring to the Zayin Melachim of Tayu, that comes from Esav, and the Vayamos is the Misa. But what's Mes? The Mes caused Rapach, 288 sparks. Those are the 288 Netzutze Kedusha that fell as a result of the shattering, the breaking of the containers and vessels of Tayu. So Rapach Netzutzes is the general number of all the sparks in the world. Which doesn't sound like a big number, right? Because if there's a big world, it seems like for thousands of years was trying to gather 288 sparks. That sounds like a lot of time. So Alter Rebbe explains in Teireh and Vayeshev that I mentioned, he asks a question, because Arizal continues to explain that when it says, the Erev Rav Ole Moam, that when they left Mitzrayim, Erev Rav, what's Erev Rav? Rav is Reish Beis, so that's 202 of the 248 sparks. Ole Imam, they were mile of that from Mitzrayim. So that's pretty good, that in 210 years in Mitzrayim, we were Mevada 202 sparks. So the Alter Rebbe asks, so that seems strange. In 210 years, you're only elevating 202 sparks. And since then, we're already now, the Alter Rebbe's time was a little less, but now it's already 3,335 years later, and we're talking about only 86 sparks. Pei Vov. Some places, there's a Maimel Lahavan Inyan Lekichas in Anshe Chaya from the Mittler Rebbe, the Rebbe HaChassidus in Tafshin Chaf Gimel, I think. And where he says that that's why we only have 86 mitzvahs Esa today. In other words, after Churban Bayis Mikdash, most of the mitzvahs Esa are connected to Tluyas B'Mikdash, Tluyas B'Oretz. It's a whole shaka v'tari about, is it actually 86? The Rebbe actually, when the Maimah was printed, the Rebbe said to gain is the Maimah because of that. They couldn't find a source for it. But it's not in the gay right now. Be'el Mamish, there's 86 sparks. The Alter Rebbe asks, why does it take thousands of years to be Mevarat 86 sparks? And his answer is a double answer. It's two parts. First of all, the neshama is then when neshamas klolis. So one neshama had the power of many. Today it's neshamas pratius. Like he explains in Perek Lamed Zayin and Tanya, it says Shishim Ribi Esis L'Teira, Shishim Ribi Yisrael. There's much more than 600,000 Jews, because those are neshamas klolis. By the time of Matan Torah, by the time of Yitzias Mitzrayim, 600,000 men after Ben Esed, between 20 and 60. But the neshamas klolis, but the neshamas break down. So neshama klolis can do a lot more birur in shorter time than neshama pratis. And the netzutzas are also that way. The netzutzas are also netzutzas klolis, because there's a lot more than 288 birurim. So there's 288 categories, so to speak. And they break down into thousands, millions, billions even. So that's why the neshamas klolis then had the power to be mevada. This explains another thing, which is just agav. It's a good thing to know, because a lot of people ask the question, why don't we make just like this Tisha B'Av for Churban Beis HaMikdash, why don't we commemorate the Holocaust? Why don't we make a sad day for the Holocaust, a Yom HaShoah? Or the same thing with the Hatzalas. Every Hatzalah is only Pesach and Purim and Chanukah. What about all the other miracles that happen? So the Rebbe, based on this Teireh in Purim Tavshin Tezayin, explains, if you want to look it up, it's very interesting Sikha, because it's the same idea. Indeed, those Yomim Tevim are not just for them. They were Neshamas Klolis. So whatever they went through contains in it everything we would go through all of history, like Ma'aser Ovesim L'Bonim Al Derech. So the Holocaust, actually, in Tisha B'Av, we do commemorate the Holocaust. We commemorate every Churban, not just the Churban Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, the very idea of Helam of Elikus, which is the cause of the Churban, and B'Mela, every Helam throughout history is a so-called a Prat in Tisha B'Av. And the same thing with every Geula is a Prat in Yitzias Mitzrayim, based on this Teireh. So it's just an interesting way of looking at it. It's not like, okay, their holiday, their events mattered and our events are trivial. No, it's a prat and a klal. Okay, and that's, of course, so when we celebrate Pesach, we're not just celebrating Yitzias Mitzrayim, we're celebrating every Yitziyah from Mitzarim v'Gvulim. So that establishes Apach is the 288, 202 when it's battered in Mitzrayim, which explains right away why Mitzrayim is Reishal Kol HaGolios. Because Mitzrayim was a klal. When the Neshamas klolis, everything that happened to them gave koyach till the end of history. That's why we say Kimeit Seis Chemeretz Mitzrayim. Ela Maseh Bnei Yisrael Sheyotzu Mitzrayim. Anechi Hashem Elekecha Sheyotzicha Meretz Mitzrayim. How does it suddenly come in Aseret Adibros? Because Tzisicha Meretz Mitzrayim is not a one-time event. Every event in history is a continuation of the Birurim that happened back in then and continue. And as long as we don't avada all the netzutzes, the 202, still not all of them. Another point that needs to be made, what do you do when you want to clean up a mess? Right? Usually, how do you clean up a mess? First you clean up the easy part, and you leave the last part for the end. Like you clean out the bottom of a pot, that comes at the end. Or you have tangled wires. First you untangle the easy parts, and then you're stuck with the last pieces. Which also explains that the netzutzes that were nizbarav back then were easier nitzutzis to be mizbarer. And as the generations went on, became more difficult nitzutzis, more darker, harder. That's why we have today a matzav of teneke shenishbu. The challenges today are far more difficult. So in the Chanami, they were higher neshamis, but they also they did the so-called the berurim, the easier ones. Today you have to deal with berurim that are very, very dark. I once heard there's a mashal from the Mittler Rebbe. Based on this mashal, once heard by HaChassidus Fabrengen, it was just well said, so I want to just chaz it over. It's a very interesting way of looking at things. The Mittler Rebbe has a whole mashal about people who live under the ground, and the Rebbe brings it sometimes, and they live under the ground and they forget where they come from. And bottom line is that each generation is more darker than the previous one. But let me give you the example as I heard it, based on the Mittler Rebbe's example. Imagine you send out a team to excavate diamonds. So diamonds are found. You have to go into very deep caves where there's coal and there's other rock, and it's dangerous. Mining is dangerous. So you have to go into these deep caves and find the diamonds. So you send out a whole team into these caves. So part of the team, they find the diamonds that are easy to see. Others have to go deeper in, and even more deeper. Now what happens? Those that find them right away, they come back, they found their diamonds, they did their job. The ones that are deeper in, it's more dangerous, and they work harder, and they also can be sarconis involved. Danger. As well as the fact that as they come out, they're probably going to be more dusty and more covered up because they had to work underground. It took a longer time. What is the most precious diamonds are the ones that are in the deepest parts of the caves. And there, the biggest danger. And when the miners come out with the diamond, they're completely covered in dust. You can't even recognize them. So the mashal that was given was that through the generations, it's exactly what the Eibishter did. When he created the world, and he scattered them all over the world. And the earlier generations, which had a lot of strength, they of course found the most obvious diamonds. As the generations went on and the Golas became harsher, and in Golas itself, in Golas Edom, you can't compare right after Churban Beis Hamikdash to the later generations, where assimilation and everything we have today. So to the point that sometimes, like the Friedrich Rebbe says, B'Shem Yisrael Yechuna, you can't even recognize a Jew. He's completely covered in dust. Because the Jews that are in families and homes that are so assimilated or even intermarried, you almost don't see that there's a Jew left. But the neshama is always there. And they are in a place in the deepest part of the cave, and it's the hardest birur, but it's the most precious diamonds. And that's why the Alter Rebbe says that Moshe Rabbeinu was an onov b'fnei kol adam, shal pnei adama, because he saw the last generation of Ikvus the Mashiach, that with all the Nisenis and all the Halamas, and we don't have miracles, we don't have the Giluyim that they were there by Yitzis Mitzrayim or Matan Torah and earlier generations, and there's still Eden that are standing and trying to go to Shul Yom Kippur, whatever effort they make. For him, that was the anova, because he's blown away by that. That there's still because those sparks are the most precious ones. So in a sense, the nitzutzes get more difficult as it goes on. That's why the last sparks may just be the last ones, but they're the hardest ones to find because they're in the darkest places. So it's not a coming to explain or justify assimilation. It comes to explain after the fact that there's a chfivus. I remember hearing once from Shalom Ber Veshetsky, Olav Shalom. He worked in Hadara Torah in the early years. So Hadara Torah is the first Baal Tshuva yeshiva here in Crown Heights. It was established in the early 60s. And was, then America was going through upheaval, and there was the hippie movement, but that Rebbe made it into something that the young are very receptive now. So there's a lot of rebellion, and there's a lot of Ibn revolution going on. So around that time, the Hadara Torah was founded. Yisrael Jacobson, no relation to me. He was the one that established it, of course, under the Rebbe's direction and Heiras. But it was very controversial, Because remember, till that point, yeshiva was a yeshiva usually of Bochrim and or the girls' schools that were from Anash. And here you're bringing in people who were completely born very different environment. And I remember even in my day, in Maristan, there was Teferes Bachurim, the Balchuva Yeshiva, and there were those that said, we have to keep our Bochrim separate from them. I mean, what their cheshbon was, I mean, they're not born Betara, or other things, different Nisyanis, as if Kavyachal, we're like the holy ones. But, okay, that was the perception. The culture, the society. Today it's, I think, more surprising probably that you even hear this. But there was attitudes like that. Ad kedei kach, and I heard mamash the story, but it's just a tremendous maisa. So it was a guy, one of the guys from, I don't know the name of the person, wasn't told to me, for obvious reasons. He was in Yechidus by the Rebbe. And he, I don't know, he expressed himself very negatively about Hadar HaTeira. I'll say what he said. He says something very sharp to the Rebbe. He said that people are wondering, what's this? This is bringing all these hippies and all these Schwarzjahr or whatever you call it. He called them the Mishkav Zocherniks, basically homosexuals. That's what he called them. As he said, Mishkav Zocherniks to the Rebbe, bringing them into our community. And this is what happened. Listen to this. You won't believe this. The Rebbe stood up. The Rebbe said like this, Ameret. He said to the Rebbe, Ameret, the Elam Ret, in other words, about this why we established such a yeshiva here that's bringing all these dark elements into our community. The Rebbe stood up and he put his hands on the table like this. And we know when the Rebbe did that, he was usually very upset. I heard this from HaChassidus. And he said to him, Vegen vemeret men das da. You know, he said meret. He says, Vegen vemeret men das da. Twice the Rebbe said. Mizdach meitzi, the Rebbe said, Yoker min hazelel. That's what the Rebbe said. We're drawing out Yoker, the precious, from the dross, from the zelel. So he realized suddenly, this guy, that the Rebbe, he's talking about the Rebbe. It was the Rebbe that established this yeshiva. He didn't realize. And he said to the Rebbe, meret, such an expression. So he was so overwhelmed, he ran out of the Rebbe's room. He ran out because he couldn't stand it. He was so embarrassed. And he meets Rabbi Shesky across the street, the Eastern Parkway, across the service lane. And he's like pale, and Rabbi Shesky says to him, what happened? He says, I was by the Rebbe, and I told him exactly what happened. He says, you better go back. I don't know if you went back or write a letter, you better ask Mechila, because the Rebbe's Mason. The Rebbe's saying this, and I told you that. So he did that. The end, I'm sure the Rebbe was meichel him, but I just point out that the Rebbe said, "Wegen wem Rebbe does that?" It was like, and meitzi yokim in hazel. Why? Because the Rebbe looked at the exact opposite. This is the Nitzutzik Dusha. They just fell in a very dark place, which of course was a revolution because most Frumim don't see it that way. And today, this is common. For us, it's common. An neshama is a neshama. It doesn't matter how far it fell. Obviously, it's sad to see Atinik Shanishba. It's sad to see intermarriage, sad to see all the assimilation. But at the end of the day, that's the job, is to find those final Nitzutzik Kedusha. Echad mehem gola lebarbaria, lesamatya. The famous language in Medrash the Rebbe quotes often. Pizran bein ha'umas. So essentially, Mitzrayim is the beginning of this process. What we're doing today, we'll talk in a minute about the end of Birur Netzutzes that the Rebbe called, that's finished. But what we've been doing through thousands of years is essentially the story of Mitzrayim. So it's not some disconnected story. And it adds a whole other dimension. You're sitting by the Seder and saying the Haggadah. So yes, it's a Zeichli Tzis Mitzrayim. That's one aspect to it. But we all know, by Yom Mehem Bizman Hazeh, we're recreating it, we're reliving it, and it's what's happening now. Every prat that happened there is supposed to be happening in our Aveda now. And we understand the concept of Birur Netzutzes in this sense, that began the 202 Netzutzes. And now that continues, gives us the koyach for the rest of the sparks. It changes the whole way of looking at the relevance of Yitzis Mitzrayim and Pesach today. So continue the theme. So if you go to the Maimorim, I'm now talking Samach Tes and Tovshin Tes, really powerful Maimorim. If you have time, you should definitely check it out. Because it also, especially in Tovshin Tes, where he's Meirech on it, he explains what is the last, so what is Taka the Nitzutz, the Birur HaNitzutzes today. So he says there that the last two Goliaths, so we went through Goliath Bavel, talks about that. If I recall correctly, Mitzrayim is Keser. I think Bavel and Modai and Toras and Yavon, I think he connects to the Chacham Eichen and Midas. And he says the last two Goliaths in our time is what? Is Goliath Eden and Goliath Ishmael. Interesting. And this is known in HaChassidus that the last two Goliaths. So, some people say, where is Ishmael? Well, first of all, look, Israel is surrounded by Ishmael. And Edom is the rest of the world. Edom is Remi. Soyer is Edom, Esav is Edom. Who is the grandson of Edom? Of Esav is Magdiel Zu Remi, as the Rashi says at the end of Vayishlach. So Rome, which is essentially the beginning of the Western Christian world, is the children of Edom. Golus Edom is the Golus of the Western world. I mean, if you look in the way that Alter Rebbe explains it, that there's the Golus Tachas HaYishmaelim, which was under the Muslims, and the Golus Tachas Edom, which is under the Christians. Interesting thing, the Alter Rebbe says in a Maimer, that why Ashkenazim have more Chumris than Sfardim. You see Pesach, for example. In other places it says because a Chumrah comes as a result of the Pirtzis, of the Gzeiris. So you need a Chumrah because Asyu Seyog L'Teira, because, Motzabika is also Legeder. So the more Chumras shows that there were more challenges. That's why they needed Chumras. Where were there more challenges? In Golus Edom more than in Golus Ishmael. Because the Ishmaelim were not as harsh on the Eden as the Christians were. Interesting word from the Alter Rebbe. So these two Goliaths are the two main Goliaths in the last few thousand, well, I would say after Churban Bayesheni. With most of us really in Golus Edom. But remember, the Eden living in all the Sephardic countries, under Spain, when Spain was the Moors, and of course we're talking about all the Arab countries and so on, that was Yishmael. So there's the two Goliaths. He explains there that Golus Yishmael and Golus Edom and Golus Yishmael, the two last Goliaths, is Netzach and Heid. They correspond to Netzach and Heid. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, and Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe elaborates, that Netzach and Heid means we don't have Giluyim like Ava, V'yirech, Chesed, and Gvura. That was Zman Abayis, or the earlier Goliaths. Now we have Netzach and Heid. Netzach is the Midas HaNetzachim. Mam is the same Asius like in Maimah Bas Legani. The Anshe Chayil, the simple soldiers, they don't need to have all the Giluyim, they don't need to know all the Cheshbenis. They just have a persistence of Midas HaNetzachim. We have to win the war. And what's the war? Finishing the last Birurim in Golus. Heid is from the word Heidah. Heidah is doing it with Kabbalah self. Again, you don't need to have the Seichel and the Midas and all the Keiches HaGluyim. It's Heidah. And Netzach and Heid is the last Aveda in Golus, which of course explains so many things of what is expected of us. This doesn't mean of course we still have a mitzvah of Avos Hashem, but the Ikar Aveda, like the Alter Rebbe says in Ageres Akeres, the Ikar Aveda today is Tefillah or Tzedakah. So bottom line is that the Ikar Aveda says is Netzach and Heid. And that continues because in Mitzrayim began with Keser, the other Goliaths went through the different Madregas, and now the last Birurim is Netzach and Heid. If you look at the whole Rebbe's Nesius, and look how much the Rebbe builds on Bas Legani, which is essentially the theme of Netzach, but also the idea of Heid, you're not holding by the Madrega, but the whole concept of Shlichus. The Rebbe didn't say you have to be a Shalom and Ava and Yira before you go out on Shlichus. There's work to be done. So, Haidah, Kabbalah Sale, and Netzach, persistence and consistency. By Morim, you have an understanding of the context of things. I'll just say, the Milsa. I did research on this when back a few times. Tafresh Samach Tes was the English year. Tafresh Ayin was 1910. Tafresh Samach Tes was 1908. Tafresh Tes is essentially 1949, right after Israel became a state. I noticed this because I remember when the Rebbe said a Maimer in Tovshim Amalef, I think, was the first intifada, the first attack in Eretz Yisrael, terrorist attacks. And the Rebbe said, basically, Chazir, I think it was Pesach, Memalef, I'm almost sure, maybe Membeis, I don't remember positive, Memalef or Membeis. And he spoke these Maimorim. So, we always knew that the Rabbeim, when they said a Maimer, was often connected to the time. It was like a birur of the Avir, Zichuch Avir. So that's when I went back to Tafshin Tes and then Tafshin Sam, and I saw that all of these Maimonim were said in times where there was a major shift in the world of Golus Yishmael. In 1908 was the beginning of when the Ottoman Empire was the last real Yishmael empire. They controlled a big part of the Middle East. They controlled Israel. They controlled that whole area until Great Britain took over by World War I. So the Ottoman Empire fell approximately then. Tafshin Tes was right at the beginning of, not that it was recognizing the state of Israel, but beginning of that Kufa. And Tafshin Mem Aleph was also. And I noticed that all three times that Abayim spoke about Birur of Yishmael. So I'm not saying I know for sure. I didn't hear it from any source. I didn't hear it from the Rabbeim. But interesting, Hashgacha Pratis. It's hard to imagine that it's about random. It just happens to be. Because the fact is, when the Rabbeim said a Maimer was a way of giving an Asinis Keach for the Birur of that time. Interesting, until September 11th, when Osama bin Laden and the Muslims attacked the World Trade Center, I can tell you, most people didn't talk about Yishmael too much. Why? Because it was an issue in the Middle East. It didn't affect America. It affected Jews because they were in Israel. But after 9/11, I don't know if you guys remember, maybe you're too young to remember, but I can tell you from my work, suddenly there was a fascinating interest by everyone, wanted to understand what is this Muslim world, what do they believe in? Because here they brought it home. They attacked America. And everybody, even till this day, books were selling off the shelves to understand Muslim philosophy and so on, what they're thinking, what do they want, because it was not understood. What do they want? It was like mamish what it says in the Torah, Yishmael, Yode Bakel V'yad Kol Bey, like wild. What? Usually you attack a country, you attack the World Trade Centers, you're beginning an assault on all of America. But we knew they were not going to attack America. So what was exactly the kavanah? I don't want to go into it right now. I've written a lot of articles on this. But my point I want to make is that the Maimorim come alive when you actually look at the events in our time. What do we have today? A matzav mamish that. Who are the two last so-called powers? There's the Arab world, especially the Eibishter gave them oil. And there's the Edom. So when the Rebbe said in Tafshin Nun that Russia fell, and people wondered, what was the big thing? Russia fell. So Germany fell after World War II. And other empires fell throughout history. Why was the Rebbe so that Russia fell bloodless, the Soviet Union? Because Soviet Union was the last empire of Golus Edom that was Miyasa, that Gepainik Eden. America is also Edom. But America is Edom of Chesed, a Malchus al Chesed. Look what it does for the Jewish people. It welcomed them. The Soviet Union was a prison. The Jews suffered tremendously there. Like the Rebbe always would say, 70 years. Ilmol Negdua, and all of that. So, but the Rebbe wasn't just a small thing. When you understand these Maimorim, you understand Edom represents what Esav. And what is Esav? The antithesis to Yaakov. V'yisreitzatzu b'kirbo. Lum Yemetz, two nations inside you, the Eibishter says. Kishazeh comes and Nefel. So it's not just a small matter. Going back, Mamish Yaakov and Esav in the womb of Rivka, there's already a battle because the battle between Edom and between Esav and Yaakov, Edom and Yisrael. So these battles, when the Rebbe would speak about all the times about the Birurim are finished, he always quote the Yaakov Avinu. And when Yaakov met Esav after 20 years, what did he do? He wanted to see if Esav was already in his barer. Because he thought that Esav was ready to go to the Gul, and then he realized, no, he's not. So that's when Yaakov said, Visnala li'iti, even though he reconciled with Esav to some extent. But we have to go slowly because the Berurim are not finished. When the children will grow older, and the Tzein Rakis, etc., will ultimately come, V'hoisla Hashem Amlucha, as Rashi brings in Vayishlach. And then the Rebbe says in the famous Vayishev Nun Beisicha that was then. The Alter Rebbe opposed Tzarfas. Tzarfas was Edom, Tachlis of Edom, Keichev Eitzim Yadi, godlessness, and it was the Eden were not ready yet. Even though Begashmis it would have been easier, but Russia, the Tsarist Russia, was more difficult physically, but spiritually it would not have compromised the Eden so much. And then the Rebbe says now 7 generations later, we're ready to be Mavarer Edom. Sarfas. the whole Sikh in Vayeshev Nun Beis, which is, of course, a Chiddush, also one of the biggest Chiddushim, because Mamish, the Rebbe is saying clearly, the Alter Rebbe, not that Chaz V'Shalom, the Alter Rebbe would have done exactly as the Rebbe did, but the Rebbe is saying there's a Shinui in Zman, Shmi Shinui Atkufa. So the whole Ishtalshus of Berurim are right here in the story of Yaakov and Esav. It's Edom and Eden. When you throw in Yishmael, son of Avram, you have an additional element, and that's the last Birur. So it puts into context, if you think of Yetzias Mitzrayim in that historical context, you have really an unbelievable story. I'll share with you this. Maybe some of you heard this before. I found it settled out of the blue. I don't know where. Something came my way. A copy of Ksaviyat. It's probably in Mefursim already. To Harav Zev Greenglass, all of us all. Remember? Mashpia, the Makubal from Montreal. He writes to the Rebbe, from the Ksaviyat, it's Nikir, it's around Tov Shin Mem. I can't say for sure, but being so familiar with the Ksaviyat, it looks like Tov Shin Mem. He writes to the Rebbe an interesting shayla. He says, now Maimer, a Pesach Maimer actually, I think Vehechrim, Lamed Aleph, Tafresh Lamed Aleph, from the Rebbe Marash. He writes that the Maimer says the following words. He's writing to the Rebbe, that Af Sheyod, that Avram was mispal for his son Yishmael, Lu Yicheh Yishmael Lefonov. He wanted Yishmael to inherit him, to continue. And Af Sheyoda Avram Masheyase Yishmael Ba'achris Hayomim. Still he was mispal. That's what the Marash adds. That even though Avram knew what Yishmael would do Ba'achris Hayomim, it's an interesting statement. What means Achris Hayom? What would Yishmael do? This is Tov Shin Mem. We're just talking about and he asked the Rebbe, what does it mean? And he says, maybe the kavanah is the Zayar Seif Pasha Ve'era. And the Rebbe adds, V'rei Zayar Seif Pasha Bolok, V'ubepiyut Yisrael Nesha, in Gimel Yem Gimel Deslichas. I don't know if the Rebbe writes Yem Gimel Deslichas, but he writes Bipiyut Yisrael Nesha, which says what? It says, it was the Lashon, Kilo Seir V'chamosei, right? That Seir, which is Edem, and Chamosei and his father-in-law, Yishmael should be Kilo, it hints to, they should be, Kilo means like Kiloim, they should be annihilated. V'oid become Mekemus. That's what the Rebbe writes. Think about this. So you got to see this Zayar. We don't have a lot of time. I'll just chazir the Zayar very briefly. This is mind-blowing. Look in Zayar, Seif Pasha Ve'era. Mam is the last page. Then look in Bolok, with the Rebbe adds, and then the Piyut. And then the thing that really struck me was that over Eid become Mekemus, or something like that. It will become Mekem. In other words, it wasn't a small matter. The Rebbe was saying this is a Yeduadik Inyan for those that know. In other words, the concept that Yishmael would do something b'achris hayomim, and nevertheless Avram was mispal for him, is already hinted to in all these ayahs. What does it say in Seif Pasha Ve'era? Briefly, it says the son of Yishmael comes to the Eibishter and says to him, Eino Chanami, Yitzchak was Nimel L'Shmeini Yomim, but Yishmael was Nimel L'Shleishas Shana. He was 13 years old. So he also gets to have schar for bris. So the Eibishter says, you're right. Since his bris was not like Tomim, 8 days, it was only 13 days, so I'll give him schar for 400 years, I think he says. He'll have control over my land, Eretz Yisrael, for 400 years. That's what the Zayar says. After the 400 years are over, he will lose control over it, Yishmael, Bnei Yishmael, of course, and then there'll be a Melchama between Yishmael will attack Edom, and who will come out? Yisrael, Eisachayel, Eden will come out on top, and then the Geula will come. That's what it says in Zayar Seif Pasha Ve'era. Check it out, I'm not making it up. Now this is a Zayar that is talking about at least 2,000 years before Achris Hayom. In Seif Pasha Bolok says something similar. When the towers fell in 9/11, people were quoting the Bolok. I hadn't seen that settle yet, I don't think then. In Bolok it talks about that. There'll be a Bechama between Yishmael and Edom, and towers will fall. And the Rebbe Tzeichen is that Zayar. I'm just telling you. And then, of course, Yisrael Nesh. I mean, the fact Kilo Seir V'Chamosei tells you something right away. And there's a lot to say on this topic because you start looking into it. What's the story with Esav and Yishmael? There's a whole story with Machlas. That Esav first went to marry the daughter of Yishmael. Then that didn't work out. And then later he married her later after Yishmael died. So there's a whole Abarbanel that talks about how this caused so much problems later in history. The bottom line is, the bitter of Yishmael and Edom, Befedish in these Maimorim, is essentially where we're at right now. Now the Rebbe says the birurim are finished, which means that 288 sparks, and now we have to open our eyes. This deserves its own discussion, but briefly, we still have work to do, because opening your eyes apparently takes a lot of work. You can have your eyes open physically, but they're not open beruchnis. But what I wanted to really do is just put the whole Yetzias Mitzrayim in so-called modern context of where we stand today. And that's why it's such a fundamental thing to say that by the Haggadah, that the end of Yetzias Mitzrayim is Geula Amitis Vashlema. That's why this last days of Pesach is focused on that, especially Achron Shel Pesach, is Mamish Geula. That's the Haftarah, and that's the energy of that day, because it's the end of the process that began Yetzias Mitzrayim 3,335 years ago. Ten l'chachem v'yech kameid. Everyone should have a kosher and freilich in Pesach. Experience open your eyes and see all these berurim that have been elevated and refined. And may we be zecher ready to the Geula long before Pesach, before Yiraf Nisan even. And it should be a very transcendent and meaningful Pesach, and we'll see each other afterwards. A good Chiddush and a good kosher and freilich in Pesach. Thank you.